The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton as Colonel Sarah Mitchell adjusted her civilian clothes one final time before stepping out of her quarters. At 42, she had spent the better part of 2 decades climbing the ranks of the United States Marine Corps, earning respect through grit, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. Today marked the beginning of what would become one of the most challenging assignments of her distinguished career. Sarah had been handpicked by Marine Corps headquarters to conduct an undercover assessment of leadership dynamics and unit cohesion at Forward Operating Base Whiskey, a remote installation that had been experiencing concerning reports of declining morale and questionable command decisions. The mission required her to assume the identity of a newly transferred staff sergeant, temporarily concealing her true rank to observe the base's operations from within the enlisted ranks. The deception wasn't taken lightly. Sarah had undergone weeks of preparation, studying the background of her assumed identity and practicing behaviors that would make her blend seamlessly with the junior enlisted personnel. Her commanding officers had stressed the importance of this mission, as recent intelligence suggested that poor leadership at FOB Whiskey could potentially compromise critical operations in the region. As she made her way to the transportation hub, Sarah reflected on the irony of her situation. She had worked tirelessly to earn the respect that came with her rank, yet now she would have to suppress every instinct that marked her as a senior officer. The challenge excited her as much as it concerned her, knowing that the success of this mission could impact the lives of hundreds of Marines under her eventual command. The helicopter ride to FOB Whiskey took 3 hours, during which Sarah remained in character, engaging in casual conversation with the other passengers while carefully observing their interactions and attitudes. She noted the subtle signs of respect and camaraderie that existed among the genuine enlisted personnel, making mental notes of behaviors she would need to emulate convincingly. FOB Whiskey appeared on the horizon like a small fortress carved into the desert landscape. The base housed approximately 800 Marines and Navy personnel, serving as a critical logistics hub for operations throughout the region. As the helicopter touched down, Sarah felt the familiar rush of anticipation that came with beginning a new assignment, though this time it was tinged with the unique tension of maintaining her cover. The processing station was a blur of paperwork and briefings, all of which Sarah navigated while maintaining the demeanor of a seasoned but not exceptional staff sergeant. She answered questions about her fabricated service history with practiced ease, drawing on her extensive knowledge of Marine operations to create believable responses that wouldn't draw unwanted attention. Her assigned quarters were sparse, but functional, typical of enlisted accommodations on a forward operating base. Sarah unpacked her gear methodically, taking care to arrange her personal items in a way that would support her cover story. Every detail mattered in maintaining the illusion that would allow her to gather the intelligence her superiors needed. The first few days at FOB Whiskey passed without incident as Sarah acclimated to the rhythm of base life. She observed the interactions between different ranks, noting the subtle power dynamics that existed within the command structure. What she discovered troubled her more than she had anticipated. There was a pervasive sense of disconnect between the officer corps and the enlisted personnel, manifesting in ways both obvious and subtle. Junior officers seemed more concerned with advancing their own careers than with the welfare of their Marines, while senior enlisted leaders appear to have grown complacent in their positions. The result was a command climate that discouraged initiative and fostered resentment among the lower ranks. Sarah documented these observations carefully, building a comprehensive picture of the systemic issues that needed to be addressed. Her cover identity required her to work in the base supply section, a position that provided excellent opportunities to interact with personnel from across the installation. She quickly established herself as a competent and reliable Marine, earning the grudging respect of her supposed peers while being careful not to display knowledge or skills that would seem inconsistent with her assumed rank. The supply depot was managed by Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran whose dedication to his Marines was evident in every interaction. Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by his leadership style, which balanced high standards with genuine concern for his subordinates. However, she also noticed that Rodriguez seemed increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as interference from higher command levels. During her second week at the base, Sarah began to identify specific individuals who would become central to her assessment. Captain Bradley Morrison, the supply company commander, embodied many of the problems she had been sent to investigate. Morrison was ambitious, but lacked the practical experience and emotional intelligence necessary to effectively lead Marines in a challenging environment. Morrison's approach to leadership relied heavily on strict adherence to regulations and procedures, often at the expense of mission effectiveness and unit morale.
Stand down,
He
both
seemed
of
to
you.
view his current assignment as merely a stepping stone to higher command, showing little interest in developing meaningful relationships with his subordinates or understanding the unique challenges they faced in their daily operations. First Sergeant Williams represented another problematic element in the command structure. While technically competent, Williams had become cynical and disengaged over the course of his career, going through the motions of leadership without the passion or commitment that effective senior enlisted leaders required. His attitude had a corrosive effect on the unit's culture, particularly among junior Marines who looked to him for guidance and inspiration. Sarah also identified several promising junior leaders who were struggling to maintain their effectiveness within the dysfunctional command environment. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Chun stood out as particularly noteworthy, demonstrating exceptional technical skills and natural leadership abilities despite receiving little support or recognition from her superiors. Chun had been passed over for promotion twice, apparently due to her willingness to advocate for her Marines when she believed they were being treated unfairly. Sarah observed several instances where Chin's intervention had prevented minor issues from escalating into serious problems, yet her efforts seemed to go unnoticed by the chain of command. The base's operational tempo was demanding but manageable, with regular supply convoys and equipment maintenance cycles that kept all personnel busy throughout each day. Sarah threw herself into the work with characteristic intensity, quickly becoming known as someone who could be counted on to complete any assigned task efficiently and effectively. Her reputation for reliability opened doors to informal conversations with other Marines, providing valuable insights into their concerns and perspectives. Many expressed frustration with what they perceived as a disconnect between the orders they received and the realities they faced in executing their missions. Others worried about their career prospects, feeling that good performance went unrecognized while political maneuvering seemed to determine advancement opportunities. Sarah carefully documented these conversations, building a comprehensive database of information that would inform her eventual recommendations. She was particularly troubled by reports of promising young Marines considering leaving the Corps due to poor leadership experiences at FOB Whiskey. The loss of such talent would have far-reaching implications for the Marine Corps' future effectiveness. The dining facility became a crucial observation post for Sarah's mission, as it was one of the few places where all ranks regularly interacted in a relatively informal setting. She made it a point to eat her meals there regularly, rotating between different seating areas to observe interactions across the entire spectrum of the base's hierarchy. What she witnessed during these meals reinforced her growing concerns about the command climate. Officers typically segregated themselves from enlisted personnel, missing opportunities for the kind of informal mentorship and relationship building that characterized healthy military units. When interactions did occur across rank boundaries, they were often stilted and formal, lacking the mutual respect and camaraderie that effective military organizations required. Sarah also noticed troubling patterns in how different groups of Marines treated each other. There was a pervasive sense of competition rather than cooperation, with individuals more focused on protecting their own interests than on supporting their teammates. This attitude was particularly pronounced among junior officers, who seemed to view their peers as potential obstacles to advancement rather than partners in accomplishing the mission. The base's training programs provided another window into the unit's dysfunction. Mandatory training sessions were poorly planned and executed, with little consideration given to their relevance or effectiveness. Marines approached these requirements with resignation rather than enthusiasm, viewing them as obstacles to completing their actual work rather than opportunities for professional development. Sarah observed one particularly telling incident during a leadership training seminar led by Captain Morrison. The session was supposed to focus on building trust and communication within small units, but Morrison's approach was so heavy-handed and theoretical that it actually reinforced the very problems it was meant to address. Marines left the training more cynical about their leadership than when they had arrived. Physical fitness standards were another area where the base's leadership failures were evident. While Marines maintained the required fitness levels, there was little emphasis on team building or unit cohesion through shared physical challenges. PT sessions were conducted as individual requirements rather than opportunities to strengthen bonds between Marines and their leaders. Sarah participated in these sessions with enthusiasm, quickly establishing herself as one of the stronger performers in her assumed peer group. However, she was careful to excel without standing out in ways that might draw unwanted scrutiny. Her goal was to be seen as a competent Marine who took pride in maintaining high standards, not as someone whose abilities seemed inconsistent with her supposed background and experience. The base's communication systems reflected the broader leadership problems Sarah had been documenting. Information flowed poorly both up and down the chain of command, with important details often getting lost or distorted as they moved between different levels of leadership. Marines frequently found themselves operating with incomplete or outdated information, leading to inefficiencies and occasional safety concerns. Sarah witnessed several instances where junior Marines identified potential problems or opportunities for improvement, only to have their input dismissed or ignored by their superiors. This pattern discouraged initiative and created a culture where Marines learned to simply follow orders without thinking critically about their missions or suggesting improvements. The maintenance schedules for critical equipment provided another example of poor planning and communication. Sarah observed numerous instances where important maintenance tasks were delayed or performed incorrectly due to unclear instructions or inadequate coordination between different sections. These problems not only affected operational readiness, but also created unnecessary stress and frustration for the Marines responsible for maintaining the equipment. During her third week at the base, Sarah began to develop relationships with some of the more promising junior leaders, carefully building trust while maintaining her cover identity. These conversations provided invaluable insights into the specific challenges faced by Marines who were trying to lead effectively within a dysfunctional system. Staff Sergeant Chun proved to be particularly valuable as an informal source of information and perspective. Chun's combination of technical expertise and genuine concern for her Marines made her a natural leader, despite the lack of recognition she received from higher command levels. Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by Chun's ability to maintain high standards and positive morale within her section, even while operating within the broader context of systemic leadership failures. Chun confided her frustrations about the promotion system, explaining how political considerations seemed to outweigh merit in determining advancement opportunities. She described watching less qualified Marines receive promotions while dedicated and competent leaders remained in positions below their capabilities. This pattern was creating a brain drain as good Marines chose to leave the Corps rather than continue serving under such conditions. The base's security procedures provided another area for Sarah's observation and analysis. While the physical security measures were adequate, she noted concerning gaps in information security and operational security practices. Marines routinely discussed sensitive information in unsecured areas, apparently unaware of the potential risks posed by such carelessness. Sarah documented these security concerns while being careful not to take any actions that would compromise her cover or interfere with ongoing operations. Her mission was to observe and report, not to intervene directly in the base's operations. However, she made mental notes of issues that would require immediate attention once her assessment was complete. The base's relationship with local military contractors and civilian personnel revealed additional leadership challenges. Sarah observed that contract oversight was minimal, creating opportunities for waste and inefficiency that were being exploited by vendors who had learned to take advantage of the poor supervision. These problems were costing the Marine Corps significant resources while providing inferior services to the Marines who depended on them. Weather conditions at FOB Whiskey were harsh and unpredictable, creating additional challenges for both operations and morale. Sarah noted that the base's leadership seemed unprepared for these conditions, often making decisions that exposed Marines to unnecessary discomfort or risk rather than adapting their approach to account for environmental factors. The medical facilities on base were well-equipped but understaffed, creating bottlenecks that affected both routine care and emergency response capabilities. Sarah observed that many Marines were reluctant to seek medical attention for minor injuries or illnesses, partly due to the perceived stigma associated with such visits, and partly due to the practical difficulties of accessing care during busy operational periods. Recreation facilities were limited and poorly maintained, contributing to the low morale that characterized much of the base's enlisted population. Sarah noted that Marines had few outlets for stress relief or team building outside of their official duties, missing opportunities to strengthen unit cohesion and individual resilience. The base's communications with higher headquarters reflected the same problems that plagued internal communications. Reports were often delayed or incomplete, creating friction with superior commands and potentially affecting decisions that impacted Marines throughout the region. Sarah documented specific instances where poor communication had led to resource allocation problems or operational delays that could have been easily avoided. Financial management at the unit level showed signs of the same lackadaisical approach that characterized other aspects of the base's operations. Sarah observed several instances of wasteful spending or resource misallocation that indicated poor planning and oversight by the responsible leaders. These problems were not only costly in terms of immediate resources, but also created additional administrative burdens for Marines who were already stretched thin. Environmental conditions on the base created unique challenges that required adaptive leadership approaches. Sarah noted that the existing leadership seemed resistant to modifying standard procedures to account for local conditions, often resulting in unnecessary complications or reduced effectiveness. The inability to adapt and innovate reflected a broader rigidity in thinking that pervaded the command structure. Training opportunities were limited and poorly coordinated, with little consideration given to individual career development or unit capability building. Sarah observed that Marines who showed initiative in seeking additional training or education often found their efforts unsupported or even discouraged by their immediate supervisors, creating disincentives for professional growth. The base's relationship with attached units from other services revealed interesting dynamics that provided additional insights into the leadership challenges at FOB Whiskey. Sarah noted that Navy personnel assigned to the base seemed to maintain higher morale and better unit cohesion than their Marine counterparts, suggesting that the problems she was documenting were specific to the Marine chain of command rather than inherent to the base's location or mission. As her fourth week at the base began, Sarah had compiled extensive documentation of the systemic leadership problems that were undermining the unit's effectiveness. However, she knew that her most important observations were yet to come. The patterns she had identified would soon be tested in ways that would reveal the true depth of the command climate problems at FOB Whiskey. The incident that would forever change the dynamic at FOB Whiskey began on a Tuesday morning that seemed no different from any other. Sarah had settled into her routine of careful observation while maintaining her cover as Staff Sergeant Mitchell, a competent but unremarkable supply specialist. She had been documenting the base's leadership problems for nearly a month, building a comprehensive picture of dysfunction that would shock her superiors back at headquarters. The dining facility was busier than usual that morning, filled with Marines grabbing quick breakfast before beginning their daily duties. Sarah had positioned herself at a corner table where she could observe interactions across the room while appearing to focus on her meal and paperwork. She had learned to use these breakfast periods as valuable intelligence gathering opportunities, watching how different ranks interacted and listening to the conversations that revealed so much about unit morale and command climate. Lance Corporal Marcus Thompson caught her attention as he entered the dining facility. Thompson was relatively new to the base, having arrived just 2 weeks earlier as part of a routine personnel rotation. Sarah had observed him during his initial processing and noted his eager attitude and genuine desire to make a positive impression on his new unit. What concerned her was how quickly that enthusiasm seemed to be diminishing under the influence of the base's toxic leadership environment. Thompson moved through the serving line efficiently, making polite conversation with the mess hall staff and maintaining the kind of military bearing that indicated good basic training and strong personal standards. However, Sarah had noticed subtle changes in his demeanor over the past week as he encountered the reality of life at FOB Whiskey. His shoulders carried slightly more tension. His smile seemed less natural, and he had begun to adopt some of the defensive mannerisms that characterize Marines who were learning not to trust their chain of command. The mess hall was arranged in a traditional military fashion, with separate seating areas that informally segregated different ranks and units. Officers typically occupied tables near the windows, while senior enlisted personnel gravitated toward the center of the room, and junior Marines filled the remaining spaces. This arrangement wasn't mandated by regulation, but it had evolved naturally over time and reflected the social hierarchies that existed throughout the base. Sarah watched as Thompson looked around the room, searching for a place to sit. Most of the tables in the junior enlisted section were already occupied, and he seemed hesitant to impose on groups that had already formed their morning routines. This social navigation was always challenging for new arrivals, particularly when the existing unit culture wasn't welcoming to outsiders. Corporal Jake Stevens noticed Thompson's uncertainty and waved him over to a partially empty table near the far wall. Stevens was another Marine that Sarah had been monitoring closely, though for different reasons than Thompson. Stevens had been at FOB Whiskey for almost 2 years and had developed the kind of cynical attitude that often infected Marines who served under poor leadership for extended periods. Stevens wasn't malicious or incompetent, but he had learned to protect himself by adopting a confrontational stance toward anyone he perceived as weak or naive. Sarah had observed him intimidating newer Marines on several occasions, using his experience and knowledge of base politics to establish dominance in social situations. This behavior was tolerated and even subtly encouraged by the leadership structure that valued appearance of control over actual effectiveness. Thompson gratefully accepted Stevens' invitation and settled into the seat across from him, unaware that he was walking into a situation that had been building tension for weeks. Stevens had been testing the boundaries with various junior Marines, establishing himself as an informal leader among his peer group through a combination of useful knowledge and strategic intimidation. Thompson's obvious eagerness to fit in made him an attractive target for someone looking to demonstrate power. The conversation started innocuously enough, with Stevens offering unsolicited advice about base procedures and unwritten rules that could help Thompson avoid common mistakes. Sarah listened carefully while pretending to review her morning reports, noting how Stevens mixed genuinely helpful information with subtle put-downs designed to establish his superior position in their relationship. Stevens explained the various personalities among the leadership, warning Thompson about officers and senior enlisted Marines who were particularly demanding or unpredictable. Some of this information was valuable for a new Marine trying to navigate an unfamiliar environment, but Stevens presented it in a way that encouraged Thompson to view his leaders with suspicion and resentment rather than professional respect. The dynamic shifted when Thompson mentioned his previous assignment at Marine Corps Base Quantico, where he had worked in a prestigious ceremonial unit. Stevens's demeanor immediately became more hostile as he interpreted Thompson's background as a challenge to his own status. Stevens had never served in such a high-profile assignment, and Thompson's casual reference to his experience triggered defensive reactions that had been building over months of frustration with his own stalled career. Stevens began questioning Thompson more aggressively about his previous duties, searching for ways to minimize or discredit his experience. He suggested that ceremonial assignments were less demanding than real Marine Corps work, implying that Thompson might struggle to adapt to the more practical requirements of a forward operating base. The conversation was attracting attention from other Marines at nearby tables, creating an audience that encouraged Stevens to escalate his behavior. Thompson responded to the challenges with appropriate respect for Stevens's rank and seniority, but his answers revealed a level of training and experience that contradicted Stevens's attempts to portray him as inadequate. This only increased Stevens's frustration and made him more determined to establish dominance through confrontation rather than leadership. Sarah recognized the dangerous dynamic that was developing and considered her options for intervention. Her mission required her to remain in character as a staff sergeant, which gave her the authority to defuse the situation if necessary. However, any action she took would need to be consistent with her assumed identity and background, and she couldn't afford to draw attention to herself by displaying knowledge or skills that seemed inconsistent with her cover story. The situation escalated when Stevens made a disparaging comment about Marines who came from easy assignments, suggesting that they often couldn't handle the demands of real operational environments. Thompson's response was measured but firm, defending his unit and his own competence without being disrespectful to Stevens's rank. This reasonable response somehow made Stevens even more angry, as it failed to provide the submissive reaction he had been seeking. Other Marines in the dining facility had begun to take notice of the confrontation, though most were careful not to appear too interested. The base's culture discouraged intervention in disputes between Marines unless they escalated to the point of physical conflict, and, even then, junior Marines were expected to handle such situations themselves unless they specifically requested help. Sarah noted several senior Marines who were aware of what was happening, but chose to ignore it rather than take any action to defuse the tension. This passive leadership style was consistent with the pattern she had observed throughout her time at the base, where leaders avoided taking responsibility for maintaining unit cohesion and discipline unless forced to do so by regulations or direct orders from higher command. The confrontation reached a critical point when Stevens stood up abruptly, claiming that Thompson had shown disrespect through his tone of voice and attitude. This accusation was clearly fabricated, but it provided Stevens with a justification for escalating to physical intimidation. Thompson remained seated, correctly recognizing that standing would be interpreted as acceptance of Stevens's challenge and could lead to serious disciplinary action for both Marines. Stevens moved around the table to position himself directly behind Thompson's chair, using his physical presence to create pressure and discomfort. This tactic was designed to force Thompson into a response that would either establish Stevens's dominance or provide justification for further escalation. Other Marines in the immediate area began to shift uncomfortably, recognizing that the situation was moving beyond normal hazing or peer correction into potentially dangerous territory. Sarah felt the weight of her responsibility as she watched the situation develop. As a colonel, she had both the authority and the obligation to intervene in any situation that threatened the safety and welfare of Marines under her command. However, her cover mission required her to balance that responsibility against the need to maintain her assumed identity and continue gathering intelligence about the base's leadership problems. The timing of her potential intervention would be crucial. Acting too early might prevent her from observing how the situation would naturally resolve itself within the existing command structure, potentially missing important insights about the base's culture and leadership effectiveness. Acting too late could result in serious consequences for Thompson or other Marines who might become involved in the escalating conflict. Stevens's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic as his frustration mounted. He had expected Thompson to back down or submit to his intimidation, but Thompson's calm professionalism was undermining the power dynamic Stevens was trying to establish. This unexpected resistance was forcing Stevens to either escalate further or risk losing face in front of an audience that had grown to include most of the Marines in the dining facility. The tension in the room was palpable as Marines pretended to focus on their meals while actually watching the confrontation develop. Some were clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but none felt empowered to intervene. This pattern of passive observation reflected the broader leadership vacuum that Sarah had been documenting, where individual Marines were left to handle conflicts without support or guidance from their chain of command. Thompson's strategy of remaining calm and respectful was the correct approach according to Marine Corps values and regulations, but it wasn't defusing the situation as intended. Stevens interpreted Thompson's restraint as weakness rather than discipline, encouraging him to become even more aggressive in his attempts to provoke a reaction that would justify his behavior. Sarah observed several junior Marines who seemed to be learning negative lessons from the incident. Rather than seeing Thompson's restraint as an example of proper military bearing, they appear to be concluding that backing down from confrontation would only invite more aggression. This perception could have lasting effects on unit culture and discipline if left unaddressed by competent leadership. The situation reached a turning point when Stevens made physical contact by shoving Thompson's shoulder while demanding that he stand up and show proper respect. This action crossed the line from verbal intimidation into physical aggression, creating a situation that required immediate intervention according to Marine Corps regulations and basic standards of leadership. Thompson's reaction was immediate but controlled. He stood slowly and turned to face Stevens, maintaining appropriate military bearing while clearly communicating that he would defend himself if necessary. His posture and expression conveyed both respect for military hierarchy and determination to protect his own dignity and safety. This balanced response demonstrated the kind of leadership potential that made Thompson exactly the type of Marine the Corps needed to retain and develop. Stevens misinterpreted Thompson's controlled response as submission and moved to consolidate his apparent victory by continuing his aggressive behavior. He stepped closer to Thompson and raised his voice, making accusations about Thompson's attitude and competence that were clearly intended to humiliate him in front of the assembled audience. The dining facility had become completely silent except for Stevens's voice as every Marine in the room focused on the confrontation. Many were clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but the base's culture of passive leadership had trained them to avoid intervention unless they were directly threatened. This learned helplessness was one of the most troubling aspects of the command climate that Sarah had been documenting. Sarah made her decision as she watched Stevens raise his hand in what appeared to be preparation for another physical assault on Thompson. Her mission to gather intelligence was important, but her fundamental obligation to protect Marines under her command took precedence over any other considerations. She would intervene, but in a way that maintained her cover while demonstrating the kind of leadership that was so obviously lacking throughout the base. Rising from her table with the measured movements that characterized her natural command presence, Sarah projected an authority that immediately drew attention from every Marine in the dining facility. Her approach was deliberate and purposeful, conveying both confidence and control without appearing hurried or reactive. Years of leadership experience had taught her how to defuse tense situations through presence and positioning rather than volume or aggression. Stevens noticed her approach and turned to face what he assumed would be another target for his intimidation tactics. His expression showed surprise at encountering resistance from an unexpected source, but he had invested too much in the confrontation to back down easily. The audience of Marines shifted their attention between Stevens, Thompson, and Sarah, sensing that the dynamic was about to change significantly, but uncertain about how the situation would resolve. Sarah positioned herself between Stevens and Thompson, using her body language to create space and reduce the immediate physical threat. Her expression was calm, but alert, conveying both authority and readiness to respond appropriately to any escalation. She had intervened in similar situations countless times throughout her career, but never while operating undercover among Marines who didn't know her true rank and authority. The challenge she faced was unique and complex. She needed to defuse the immediate situation while maintaining her assumed identity as a staff sergeant, using only the authority and techniques that would be appropriate for that rank. At the same time, she had to project enough command presence to convince Stevens that further aggression would be both inappropriate and unsuccessful. Stevens turned his attention to Sarah with the same aggressive posture he had been using against Thompson, clearly expecting her to either support his actions or retreat from the confrontation. His assessment of the situation was clouded by frustration and the momentum of his escalating behavior, preventing him from recognizing the fundamental shift that was about to occur. Sarah stood calmly between the two Marines, her presence immediately changing the energy in the room. Years of command experience had taught her to project authority through controlled confidence rather than aggressive posturing, and that natural command bearing was evident even as she maintained her cover identity as a staff sergeant. "That's enough," Sarah said in a voice that carried clearly throughout the silent dining facility. Her tone was firm, but not shouting, conveying unmistakable authority while remaining within the bounds of what would be appropriate for her assumed rank. The simple statement carried weight that made Stevens pause, though he was too committed to his confrontational approach to immediately back down. Stevens studied Sarah's face, searching for signs of weakness or uncertainty that he could exploit. What he saw instead was the steady gaze of someone who was completely comfortable with conflict and confident in her ability to handle whatever escalation might follow. This unexpected resistance confused him and disrupted the dynamic he had been trying to establish with Thompson. "This doesn't concern you, Staff Sergeant," Stevens replied, his voice carrying less conviction than before, but still maintaining the aggressive edge that had characterized his behavior throughout the confrontation. He was clearly hoping that Sarah would defer to his initiated conflict and allow him to continue establishing dominance over Thompson. Sarah's response was immediate and decisive. "It concerns me when Marines in my vicinity are creating disturbances that affect unit readiness and discipline." Her statement was perfectly within the bounds of appropriate action for a staff sergeant, but the way she delivered it conveyed a depth of authority that made Stevens uncertain about his position. The dining facility remained completely silent as every Marine present focused on the developing confrontation. Many were surprised to see someone willing to challenge Stevens's behavior, as his aggressive tendencies had generally gone unchecked by the base's passive leadership structure. The intervention represented a departure from the established patterns that most Marines had learned to accept as normal. Thompson watched the exchange with careful attention, recognizing that Sarah was taking significant personal risk by inserting herself into a situation that could easily escalate further. Her willingness to intervene on behalf of someone she barely knew demonstrated the kind of leadership courage that had been notably absent from most of his experiences at FOB Whiskey. Stevens made his critical mistake by choosing to escalate rather than de-escalate in response to Sarah's intervention. His frustration with Thompson had been transferred to Sarah, and his inability to recognize her natural authority led him to believe that he could intimidate her into backing down, just as he had attempted to intimidate Thompson. "You need to mind your own business," Stevens said, stepping closer to Sarah in an obvious attempt to use physical intimidation. His movement was deliberate and threatening, designed to force her to either retreat or submit to his authority. The action demonstrated a complete misunderstanding of both the situation and the person he was challenging. Sarah's response was swift and professional. As Stevens moved within arm's reach, she smoothly sidestepped his advance while simultaneously placing her hand firmly on his chest to stop his forward momentum. The movement was controlled and precise, demonstrating tactical awareness and physical confidence that clearly surprised him. "Corporal Stevens," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm, but carrying unmistakable authority, "you will step back and control yourself immediately." Her use of his name and rank was calculated to remind him of military protocol, while establishing her expectation of compliance with proper behavior. The physical contact and verbal command created a moment of clarity that cut through Stevens's emotional escalation. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to recognize that he had seriously misjudged the situation and the person he was challenging. The confidence in Sarah's movement and voice suggested capabilities and experience that didn't match his assumptions about her background. However, Stevens had invested too much in the confrontation to simply back down without losing significant face in front of the assembled Marines. His position had become untenable, but his pride and frustration prevented him from making the rational choice to de-escalate. Instead, he made the decision that would transform the incident from a minor disciplinary issue into something much more significant. Stevens shoved Sarah backward with both hands, using considerably more force than he had used against Thompson. His action was clearly intended as an assault rather than mere intimidation, crossing legal and regulatory lines that would require serious consequences regardless of rank or circumstances. The aggressive move demonstrated a complete breakdown in judgment and military discipline. Sarah's response was immediate and devastating. Her years of combat training and leadership experience had prepared her for exactly this type of situation, and her reaction was both instinctive and precisely controlled. She absorbed the impact of Stevens's shove while maintaining her balance, then stepped forward to grab his uniform shirt with her left hand while simultaneously striking him in the solar plexus with her right fist. The blow was perfectly executed, designed to incapacitate without causing permanent injury. Stevens doubled over immediately, gasping for breath and temporarily unable to continue his aggressive behavior. Sarah maintained her grip on his shirt to prevent him from falling while he recovered from the impact, demonstrating both tactical skill and concern for his welfare even after his assault. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds, but its impact on everyone present was profound and lasting. Marines throughout the dining facility watched in stunned silence as Stevens struggled to regain his breath while Sarah held him steady with one hand and maintained complete situational awareness with her eyes scanning the room for any additional threats or complications. Thompson stood frozen in amazement, realizing that he had just witnessed a level of tactical proficiency and command presence that exceeded anything he had encountered since arriving at FOB Whiskey. Sarah's handling of the situation demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership competence that he had expected to find throughout the base, but had been disappointed not to discover. The silence in the dining facility was broken by the sound of chairs scraping against the floor as several Marines stood up, unsure of how to respond to what they had witnessed. Some moved closer to assess whether additional intervention was needed, while others seemed to be considering whether they should report the incident to higher authority. Sarah recognized that the next few moments would be crucial for maintaining her cover while managing the aftermath of the confrontation. She had successfully defended herself and protected Thompson, but she needed to handle the situation in a way that wouldn't draw unwanted attention to her own capabilities or background. "Corporal Stevens," she said in a voice that carried throughout the room, "you will report to the duty officer immediately and explain your conduct. Physical assault on fellow Marines is unacceptable under any circumstances." Her statement was loud enough for everyone present to hear, establishing the official narrative of what had occurred while positioning Stevens as clearly responsible for initiating the physical confrontation. Stevens gradually straightened as his breathing returned to normal, his face showing a mixture of pain, embarrassment, and growing recognition of how badly he had miscalculated the situation. The reality of his position was becoming clear as he realized that he had assaulted a senior Marine who had not only successfully defended herself, but had done so with a level of skill that suggested extensive combat training. "Yes, Staff Sergeant," Stevens replied weakly, his earlier aggression completely deflated by the physical and psychological impact of Sarah's response. His submission was complete and obvious to everyone present, establishing a clear resolution to the immediate confrontation while raising questions about Sarah's background and capabilities. Sarah released her grip on Stevens' shirt and stepped back to a position that allowed her to monitor both him and the surrounding area. Her posture remained alert but non-threatening, conveying readiness to respond to further escalation while signaling that she considered the immediate danger to be resolved. The dining facility began to return to normal activity as Marines processed what they had witnessed and returned their attention to their meals and conversations. However, the undercurrent of discussion was clearly focused on the confrontation and its unexpected resolution, with particular attention being paid to Sarah's demonstration of combat skills that seemed inconsistent with her apparent position as a supply specialist. Thompson approached Sarah as Stevens made his way toward the exit, clearly wanting to express his gratitude for her intervention. His expression showed both relief and curiosity, recognizing that he had been protected by someone whose capabilities far exceeded what he had expected from a randomly encountered staff sergeant. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," Thompson said quietly, his voice conveying genuine appreciation for her willingness to risk herself on his behalf. "I wasn't sure how to handle that situation without making things worse." Sarah nodded acknowledgement of his thanks while maintaining her cover persona. "Marines look out for each other, Lance Corporal. That's how the Corps works when leadership functions properly." Her response was carefully crafted to reinforce appropriate military values while subtly critiquing the leadership environment that had allowed the situation to develop in the first place. The reference to proper leadership functioning was noted by several Marines within hearing distance, many of whom had been thinking similar thoughts about their experiences at FOB Whiskey. Sarah's comment provided validation for their concerns while demonstrating an alternative approach to the passive leadership they had become accustomed to experiencing. Staff Sergeant Chun had observed the entire confrontation from her position across the dining facility, and she approached Sarah with obvious interest in the tactical skills that had been displayed. Chin's own combat experience allowed her to recognize the level of training and proficiency that Sarah's response had demonstrated, raising questions about her background that went beyond casual curiosity. "That was impressive handling, Staff Sergeant," Chun said as she joined the conversation. "Where did you pick up those techniques?" Her question was respectful, but pointed, reflecting her recognition that Sarah's skills suggested experience or training that wasn't typical for supply specialists. Sarah realized that her response to this question would be crucial for maintaining her cover story while satisfying the natural curiosity that her actions had generated. She needed to provide an explanation that would be believable within the context of her assumed identity while deflecting detailed inquiries about her background. "I spent some time with a reconnaissance unit early in my career," Sarah replied, drawing on actual experiences that she could discuss convincingly while remaining within the bounds of her cover story. They made sure everyone could handle themselves regardless of their primary specialty. This explanation was both truthful and misleading, providing enough detail to satisfy immediate curiosity while avoiding the specific information that would compromise her mission. The reference to reconnaissance training would explain her combat skills without suggesting the level of command experience that her true rank represented. Chun accepted the explanation with a nod of understanding, though her expression suggested that she found Sarah increasingly interesting as someone who didn't quite fit the typical pattern she had observed among other Marines at the base. The combination of tactical proficiency, natural leadership presence, and willingness to intervene in difficult situations marked Sarah as someone worth watching and potentially learning from. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation provided Sarah with valuable opportunities to observe how the base's leadership structure would respond to a serious disciplinary incident. She watched carefully as word of the situation spread through informal channels, while waiting to see whether any official response would be forthcoming from the chain of command. Captain Morrison arrived in the dining facility approximately 15 minutes after Stevens had departed to report to the duty officer. His appearance was clearly prompted by notification of the incident, but his demeanor suggested more concern about potential disruption to his command than genuine interest in addressing the underlying issues that had led to the confrontation. Morrison surveyed the dining facility briefly before approaching the area where the incident had occurred. His body language conveyed irritation rather than leadership concern, suggesting that he viewed the situation as an unwelcome complication rather than an opportunity to address command climate problems within his unit. Staff Sergeant Mitchell. Morrison called as he approached Sarah's position. His use of her assumed name confirmed that official reports were already being generated about the incident, potentially creating complications for her mission if the investigation became too detailed or extensive. Sarah stood at appropriate attention as Morrison approached, maintaining her cover identity while preparing to manage whatever questions or instructions might follow. Her response to his inquiry would need to balance honesty about the incident with protection of her mission objectives. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her tone conveying appropriate respect while maintaining the confident bearing that had characterized her handling of the entire situation. She was ready to provide whatever information Morrison required, while steering the conversation away from details that might compromise her cover. Morrison's initial questions focused on the basic facts of what had occurred, seeking to establish an official record that would satisfy administrative requirements without delving too deeply into the underlying causes or broader implications of the incident. His approach was typical of the superficial leadership style that Sarah had been documenting throughout her time at the base. Sarah provided clear and accurate answers to Morrison's questions while being careful not to volunteer additional information that might complicate her position or draw unwanted attention to her capabilities. Her goal was to be seen as a competent Marine who had responded appropriately to an emergency situation rather than someone whose skills and background warranted detailed investigation. The conversation with Morrison lasted only a few minutes, concluding with his instruction that Sarah should be available for follow-up questions if needed during the investigation of Stevens's conduct. His dismissal was abrupt and formal, lacking any acknowledgement of her actions or expression of appreciation for her intervention on behalf of Thompson. As Morrison departed, Sarah reflected on how the incident had perfectly illustrated many of the leadership problems she had been documenting. Stevens's aggressive behavior had been allowed to develop unchecked by passive supervision. The confrontation had escalated due to lack of intervention by present leaders, and the official response focused on administrative compliance rather than addressing root causes or recognizing positive leadership actions. However, the incident had also revealed something that Sarah hadn't anticipated when she began her mission. There were Marines at FOB Whiskey who possessed the skills, courage, and leadership potential to transform the base's culture if they were properly supported and empowered. Thompson's restraint under pressure, Chen's professional interest in tactical excellence, and even some of the observers' obvious discomfort with Stevens's behavior suggested that the foundation for improvement existed within the existing personnel. The challenge would be determining how to harness that potential while addressing the systemic problems that had allowed the toxic environment to develop and persist. Sarah's mission was beginning to evolve from simple documentation of problems to identification of solutions and resources that could support meaningful change. As the dining facility returned to normal operations and Marines resumed their daily routines, Sarah knew that the incident would continue to generate discussion and speculation throughout the base. Her actions had marked her as someone worthy of attention and respect, potentially opening doors to deeper insights into the unit's dynamics while also creating risks for her continued cover. The balance between maintaining her mission security and leveraging her newfound reputation for positive influence would define the next phase of her assignment. The confrontation with Stevens had been a defining moment, but its true significance would be determined by how effectively she could use the aftermath to gather intelligence and identify opportunities for the systemic changes that FOB Whiskey desperately needed. The aftermath of the dining facility incident rippled through FOB Whiskey with an intensity that surprised Sarah. Within hours of the confrontation, she found herself at the center of informal discussions throughout the base as Marines processed what they had witnessed and tried to understand its implications for their unit's culture and leadership dynamics. Word of Stevens' aggressive behavior and Sarah's decisive response had spread through the informal communication networks that existed parallel to official channels, carrying details and interpretations that varied significantly from the official reports being generated by the chain of command. These unofficial accounts often emphasized aspects of the incident that the formal investigation was overlooking or minimizing. Sarah recognized that her actions had fundamentally altered her position within the base's social structure. No longer could she remain an anonymous observer gathering intelligence without drawing attention to herself. Instead, she had become a focal point for Marines seeking alternatives to the passive leadership style that had characterized their recent experiences. The transformation in how others interacted with her was immediate and obvious. Marines who had previously acknowledged her with polite but distant professionalism now approached her with genuine interest and respect. Conversations that had once been limited to work-related topics expanded to include questions about her background, opinions on leadership challenges, and requests for advice on handling difficult situations. Thompson had become particularly attached to Sarah following her intervention on his behalf, viewing her as both a protector and a mentor figure who represented the kind of leadership he had hoped to find at FOB Whiskey. His gratitude was evident in every interaction, but more importantly, his behavior demonstrated how positive leadership examples could inspire improved performance and attitude in junior Marines. Chen's interest in Sarah had evolved from professional curiosity to something approaching partnership, as she recognized that Sarah possessed both the tactical skills and leadership philosophy that Chen had been seeking throughout her career. Their conversations began to include discussions of unit improvement strategies and potential solutions to the systemic problems that affected their daily operations. The challenge for Sarah was managing these new relationships while maintaining her cover identity and continuing her primary mission of gathering intelligence about the base's leadership problems. The increased attention made it more difficult to observe situations without influencing them, but it also provided unprecedented access to information and perspectives that had previously been hidden from review. Captain Morrison's response to the incident revealed additional layers of dysfunction within the command structure that Sarah hadn't fully appreciated during her initial observations. Rather than using Stevens' misconduct as an opportunity to address broader leadership issues or reinforce positive behavioral standards, Morrison seemed primarily concerned with minimizing administrative complications and avoiding attention from higher command levels. The official investigation was conducted with mechanical efficiency, but little genuine interest in understanding the underlying causes that had led to the confrontation. Morrison's questions focused on establishing basic facts that would satisfy regulatory requirements, rather than exploring the command climate issues that had enabled Stevens' behavior to develop and escalate unchecked. Sarah found herself frustrated by the superficial nature of the investigation, recognizing that it represented a missed opportunity to address systemic problems that would continue to affect unit morale and effectiveness. However, her position as a supposed staff sergeant limited her ability to influence the process directly, forcing her to rely on careful documentation and subtle suggestions that might eventually reach more receptive leaders. The base's informal leadership networks provided a stark contrast to the official command structure in their response to the incident. Senior enlisted Marines who had been quietly concerned about deteriorating standards saw Sarah's actions as validation of their own beliefs about proper leadership behavior, while junior Marines began to view her as an example of the kind of leader they hoped to become. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah during her second day following the incident, clearly interested in understanding more about her background and perspective on leadership challenges. His conversation was careful and professional, but it carried undertones that suggested he was evaluating her potential as an ally in efforts to improve unit culture and performance. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, Rodriguez said as he joined her during a break in supply depot operations, "I've been thinking about what happened in the dining facility. That kind of situation shouldn't have been allowed to develop in the first place." Sarah recognized the opening that Rodriguez was providing for a deeper discussion about leadership issues at FOB Whiskey. His comment was clearly intended to assess her willingness to engage with topics that went beyond her immediate responsibilities and into areas that could be sensitive for a junior leader to address openly. "You're right, Gunny," Sarah replied, using the respectful and formal title that conveyed appropriate recognition of Rodriguez's rank and experience. Good leadership prevents problems rather than just responding to them after they've escalated. Rodriguez nodded approvingly at her response, clearly pleased that she understood the distinction between reactive and proactive leadership approaches. His expression suggested that he was beginning to see her as someone who shared his concerns about the unit's direction and might be willing to support efforts to implement positive changes. Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering topics that range from specific personnel issues to broader questions about Marine Corps values and leadership philosophy. Sarah found herself walking a careful line between sharing her genuine expertise and maintaining her cover identity, providing insights that would be valuable while avoiding knowledge that would seem inconsistent with her supposed background. Rodriguez's perspectives provided valuable confirmation of many of the observations Sarah had been making during her time at the base. His descriptions of leadership meetings revealed a command structure that was more concerned with appearances than substance, where decisions were made based on political considerations rather than operational effectiveness or marine welfare. The supply depot's operations provided Sarah with an excellent vantage point for observing how the incident's aftermath was affecting different aspects of base life. Marines who came to requisition equipment or materials often engaged in conversations that revealed their thoughts about leadership, unit culture, and the changes they hoped to see implemented. Many of these conversations included references to Sarah's handling of the confrontation with Stevens, often using the incident as a starting point for broader discussions about what effective leadership should look like. These informal discussions provided valuable insights into Marine expectations and frustrations while also revealing the extent to which her actions had influenced perceptions throughout the base. Sarah noticed that younger Marines seemed particularly energized by what they had witnessed, viewing her response to Stevens as evidence that strong leadership was possible even within the constraints of the existing command structure. Their enthusiasm was encouraging, but it also created pressure for her to continue demonstrating the kind of leadership behavior that might compromise her mission if it drew too much attention from higher authorities. The base's training programs became another area where Sarah could observe the incident's ongoing impact. Marines who had previously approached mandatory training with resignation and cynicism began to show more engagement, apparently hoping that the leadership changes they were witnessing might extend to improve training quality and relevance. Staff Sergeant Chun leveraged the incident's aftermath to initiate conversations about tactical training and leadership development that had previously been discouraged by the passive command environment. Her proposals for enhanced combat skills training and leadership workshops found unexpected support among Marines who had been inspired by Sarah's demonstration of competence and courage. Sarah recognized that Chen's initiatives represented exactly the kind of positive change that could transform the base's culture if properly supported by the command structure. However, she also knew that such changes would require leadership commitment that was currently lacking among the officer corps and senior enlisted personnel in key positions. The challenge became finding ways to support and encourage positive initiatives while maintaining her cover and gathering the intelligence needed to support eventual systemic reforms. Sarah began to develop strategies for indirect influence that would allow her to promote beneficial changes without revealing her true authority or compromising her mission objectives. Captain Morrison's continued response to the incident provided ongoing opportunities for Sarah to observe leadership failures in real time. Rather than using Stevens's misconduct as a catalyst for examining and improving unit standards, Morrison seemed determined to treat it as an isolated incident that required minimal administrative response. Morrison's approach reflected a broader pattern of avoidance and denial that characterized much of the base's leadership culture. Problems were minimized rather than addressed, symptoms were treated rather than causes, and appearances were prioritized over substance in ways that prevented genuine improvement while creating additional frustrations for Marines seeking meaningful leadership. The base's communication systems revealed how information about the incident was being filtered and distorted as it moved through official channels. Reports that reached higher command levels emphasized procedural compliance rather than leadership lessons, missing opportunities to identify and address the systemic issues that had created the conditions for Stevens's behavior. Sarah documented these communication failures as part of her ongoing assessment, recognizing that they represented critical barriers to organizational learning and improvement. The inability or unwillingness of the command structure to accurately analyze and learn from significant incidents suggested deep-rooted problems that would require comprehensive intervention to resolve. First Sergeant Williams's reaction to the incident provided another illustration of the leadership vacuum that existed at FOB Whiskey. Rather than using his position and experience to reinforce positive behavioral standards or mentor junior leaders, Williams seemed to view the entire situation as an unwelcome disruption to his routine administrative responsibilities. Williams's disengagement was particularly problematic because his position as the senior enlisted leader gave him significant influence over unit culture and the development of junior Marines. His failure to provide positive leadership during a critical teaching moment represented a missed opportunity that would have lasting effects on unit morale and standards. Sarah observed several instances where Williams could have reinforced positive lessons from the incident, but chose instead to focus on minor administrative details that avoided addressing the deeper issues involved. His approach sent clear messages to junior Marines about what the command structure valued and prioritized, generally emphasizing compliance over competence and appearance over substance. The base's interaction with visiting personnel from other units provided additional perspectives on how the incident was being perceived and interpreted. Marines from outside FOB Whiskey who learned about the confrontation often expressed surprise that such behavior had been allowed to develop, suggesting that the base's problems were more severe than many residents realized. These external perspectives reinforce Sarah's assessment that FOB Whiskey's leadership problems were not normal or acceptable by Marine Corps standards. The contrast between visitor expectations and base realities provided valuable validation for her ongoing documentation, while also highlighting the urgency of implementing corrective measures. Equipment maintenance schedules and supply operations continued to provide insights into how leadership failures affected practical mission accomplishment. Sarah noted that Marines who had been energized by the incident's aftermath were beginning to show improved attention to detail and initiative in their daily work, demonstrating how positive leadership examples could enhance overall unit performance. However, these improvements were occurring despite, rather than because of the official command structure, suggesting that sustainable change would require more comprehensive leadership development than was currently available. The gap between Marine potential and actual performance highlighted the extent to which poor leadership was undermining unit effectiveness. Security procedures and protocols revealed additional areas where the incident's lessons could be applied to improve base operations. Sarah observed that Marines were beginning to take more initiative in identifying and addressing potential vulnerabilities, apparently inspired by her example of taking responsible action rather than waiting for orders or permission. These security improvements were encouraging, but also highlighted the extent to which previous leadership had failed to develop and utilize the capabilities that existed within the unit. Marines had always possessed the skills and motivation needed for enhanced security performance, but the command environment had discouraged the initiative and responsibility required to apply those capabilities effectively. The base's relationship with civilian contractors and support personnel provided another area where leadership improvements could yield significant benefits. Sarah noted that Marines who were demonstrating enhanced initiative and confidence in their military duties were also becoming more effective in their oversight and coordination of contractor activities. These improvements in contractor oversight were reducing waste and inefficiency while enhancing service quality, demonstrating how leadership development could yield practical benefits that extended beyond military-specific activities. The connection between leadership competence and mission effectiveness was becoming increasingly clear to Marines throughout the base. Medical and support services continued to reflect the broader leadership challenges that affected all aspects of base operations. However, Sarah began to notice subtle improvements in how Marines approach these services, apparently reflecting increased confidence and initiative that had been inspired by positive leadership examples. The incident had created a catalyst for change that was spreading through informal networks and personal relationships in ways that the official command structure seemed unable to recognize or harness. Sarah recognized that this organic improvement process represented both an opportunity and a responsibility that would influence the next phase of her mission. As her 5th week at FOB Whiskey began, Sarah realized that her role had evolved far beyond simple intelligence gathering. She had become a focal point for Marines seeking positive change and an example of the leadership potential that existed within the unit. The challenge would be determining how to leverage this influence while completing her original mission and preparing for the eventual revelation of her true identity and authority. The revelation of Sarah's true identity came sooner than anyone expected, triggered by events that no one at FOB Whiskey could have anticipated. 3 weeks after the dining facility incident, Marine Corps Headquarters announced an unscheduled inspection visit that would include a comprehensive review of command procedures, unit readiness, and leadership effectiveness. The announcement sent shockwaves through the base's command structure, as officers scrambled to prepare for scrutiny that many knew would reveal the systemic problems Sarah had been documenting. Captain Morrison's response was particularly frantic, as he recognized that his superficial leadership style would not withstand detailed examination by experienced inspectors. Sarah received notification of the inspection through encrypted channels that were separate from the base's normal communication systems, informing her that her mission would need to be concluded earlier than originally planned. The message also contained instructions for her to prepare a comprehensive briefing that would support the inspection team's evaluation and provide recommendations for immediate corrective action. The timing created both opportunities and complications for Sarah's mission. The inspection would provide perfect justification for revealing her true identity and authority, allowing her to transition from covert observation to overt leadership intervention. However, the accelerated timeline would require her to compile and present her findings without the additional weeks of observation she had originally planned to complete. Sarah spent the next 48 hours working continuously to organize her extensive documentation into a coherent assessment that would support the inspection team's evaluation while protecting the sources and methods she had used to gather intelligence. The report needed to balance comprehensive analysis with practical recommendations that could be implemented immediately to address the most critical problems. Her findings painted a sobering picture of systemic leadership failure that extended throughout the base's command structure. From Captain Morrison's superficial and politically motivated decision-making to First Sergeant Williams's disengaged cynicism, Sarah had documented a pattern of leadership deficiencies that were undermining unit effectiveness and Marine welfare in measurable ways. The report identified specific incidents and trends that demonstrated how poor leadership was affecting everything from operational readiness to individual career development. Equipment maintenance problems, training deficiencies, communication failures, and morale issues were all traced back to leadership decisions and behaviors that prioritized short-term convenience over long-term effectiveness. However, Sarah's assessment also identified significant strengths and opportunities within the existing personnel structure. Marines like Chun, Rodriguez, and Thompson represented leadership potential that could transform the base's culture if properly developed and supported. The challenge would be creating conditions that allowed these positive influences to flourish while removing or reforming the negative elements that had dominated the environment. The inspection team arrived on a Thursday morning, consisting of senior officers and experienced enlisted personnel who possessed the authority and expertise necessary to implement comprehensive changes. Sarah recognized several members of the team from previous assignments, confirming that Marine Corps headquarters was taking the situation at FOB Whiskey seriously enough to assign their most capable evaluators. Colonel James Patterson, the inspection team leader, was a decorated combat veteran whose reputation for thorough and fair assessment was well established throughout the Marine Corps. His presence signaled that the inspection would be comprehensive and that significant changes would likely result from whatever the team discovered. Sarah's instructions were to maintain her cover until Patterson specifically requested her participation, allowing the inspection team to conduct their initial evaluation based on what they could observe directly rather than relying immediately on her covert intelligence. This approach would provide validation for her findings while ensuring that the team's conclusions would be seen as independent and objective. The inspection began with routine administrative reviews and procedural audits that quickly revealed many of the problems Sarah had been documenting. Equipment records showed maintenance deficiencies, training logs revealed inadequate preparation and follow-up, and communication systems demonstrated the poor coordination that had characterized the base's operations. Captain Morrison's attempts to present his unit in the best possible light were undermined by the evidence of systemic problems that the inspection team uncovered during their first day of evaluation. His explanations and justifications became increasingly desperate as it became clear that superficial preparations could not disguise the fundamental leadership failures that affected every aspect of base operations. The inspection team's interviews with individual Marines provided additional confirmation of the leadership problems that Sarah had identified. Thompson, Chun, Rodriguez, and others offered candid assessments of their experiences that painted a consistent picture of poor leadership and missed opportunities for improvement. Many Marines expressed surprise and enthusiasm when they learned that higher command levels were taking their concerns seriously enough to conduct such a comprehensive inspection. The attention represented validation for frustrations they had been experiencing while also creating hope that meaningful changes might finally be implemented. Sarah observed the inspection proceedings while maintaining her cover, noting how the team's presence was affecting behavior throughout the base. Marines who had grown accustomed to low standards and poor leadership were suddenly reminded of what military excellence should look like, creating both motivation for improvement and anxiety about potential consequences. The contrast between the inspection team's professionalism and the base's existing leadership was stark and obvious to everyone involved. Patterson and his team demonstrated the kind of competent, caring leadership that Marines deserved, highlighting the extent to which FOB Whiskey had fallen short of acceptable standards. By the end of the second day, Patterson had gathered enough evidence to confirm that significant intervention would be necessary to address the leadership problems at FOB Whiskey. His preliminary findings aligned closely with Sarah's assessment, validating her documentation while providing independent verification that would support whatever corrective measures might be implemented. The moment came during the evening of the second day, when Patterson requested a private meeting with Sarah, using her assumed identity, but clearly indicating that he was aware of her true role and mission. The conversation would mark the end of her covert operation and the beginning of her transition back to overt command authority. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, Patterson said as they met in a secure conference room, "I think it's time we discuss your actual mission here." His tone was professional, but carried undertones of respect and curiosity about what she had discovered during her weeks of observation. Sarah stood at attention and responded with her true rank and identity. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, sir. I've been conducting a leadership assessment undercover for the past 6 weeks. The revelation felt both liberating and sobering as she transitioned from observer back to command authority. Patterson nodded acknowledgement of her report and gestured for her to be seated. Your preliminary findings have been extremely valuable in guiding our inspection. I'd like you to brief me on your detailed observations and recommendations before we proceed with our final evaluation. The briefing lasted 3 hours, during which Sarah presented a comprehensive analysis of the leadership problems she had documented along with specific recommendations for addressing each identified issue. Her insights provided crucial context for the inspection team's observations while offering practical solutions that could be implemented immediately. Patterson was particularly interested in Sarah's assessment of individual personnel, recognizing that successful reform would require identifying and developing the positive leadership potential that existed within the existing structure. Her recommendations for personnel changes and development programs would form the foundation for the transformation plan that would be implemented following the inspection. The discussion also covered the incident with Stevens and its aftermath, providing Patterson with insights into how leadership failures had created conditions where inappropriate behavior could flourish while positive examples struggled to gain recognition and support. The incident served as a perfect illustration of both the problems and the solutions that Sarah's mission had identified. Sarah's cover identity had allowed her to observe leadership dynamics from a perspective that would have been impossible for anyone known to hold senior rank, providing unique insights into how decisions and behaviors at the command level affected Marines throughout the organization. Her documentation would become the foundation for comprehensive reforms that extended far beyond FOB whiskey. The next morning, Patterson announced that the inspection had been concluded and that significant changes would be implemented immediately based on the team's findings. The announcement was made to the entire base personnel during a formation that emphasized the seriousness of the situation and the commitment of higher command to ensuring proper leadership standards. Captain Morrison was relieved of command effective immediately, with orders to report for administrative review and possible disciplinary action. First Sergeant Williams was reassigned to a position where his disengagement would have less impact on unit culture and Marine development. Several other leadership changes were announced that reflected the comprehensive nature of the problems that had been identified. Sarah's true identity was revealed during the same formation, creating shock and amazement throughout the base as Marines realized that the staff sergeant they had known and respected was actually a colonel who had been observing their operations undercover. The revelation explained many of the capabilities and characteristics that had set her apart from other personnel. Thompson stood in formation with his mouth open, finally understanding why Sarah had possessed the skills and confidence to handle Stevens so effectively. His respect for her actions was enhanced rather than diminished by learning her true rank, as he realized that she had chosen to protect him even though revealing her identity would have been a simpler solution. Chin's reaction was one of validation and excitement as she realized that her professional instincts about Sarah had been correct. The revelation that Sarah was a senior officer who had recognized and valued Chin's potential provided encouragement for her own career aspirations while confirming that competent leadership still existed within the Marine Corps. Rodriguez approached Sarah after the formation with a mixture of embarrassment and appreciation, recognizing that he had been confiding his leadership concerns to someone who possessed both the authority and the commitment to address them effectively. His respect for her willingness to listen and learn from enlisted perspectives was evident in every aspect of their interaction. The base's transformation began immediately as new leadership arrived, and Sarah transitioned to her overt role as a colonel responsible for implementing the reforms her mission had identified. The changes were comprehensive and immediate, affecting everything from daily operations to long-term career development programs. Sarah's first official act was to implement a series of leadership development programs that would provide Marines like Chun and Thompson with the training and opportunities they needed to develop their potential. The programs were designed to identify and cultivate positive leadership qualities while addressing the systemic problems that had previously discouraged initiative and excellence. Equipment maintenance schedules were completely revised based on Sarah's observations of the gaps between required and actual performance. New procedures emphasized accountability and continuous improvement while providing Marines with the resources and support they needed to maintain equipment to proper standards. Training programs were redesigned to focus on practical skills and leadership development rather than administrative compliance, incorporating lessons learned from Sarah's observation of what Marines actually needed to perform their duties effectively. The changes emphasized engagement and relevance over bureaucratic requirements. Communication systems were overhauled to ensure that information flowed accurately and efficiently throughout the organization, eliminating the filtering and distortion that had characterized the previous command structure. New procedures emphasized transparency and feedback to ensure that leadership decisions were based on accurate information about operational realities. The base's relationship with higher command was restructured to provide more accurate reporting and better support for unit needs, eliminating the political considerations that had previously influenced resource allocation and personnel decisions. The changes emphasized mission effectiveness and Marine welfare over administrative convenience. Within 6 months, FOB Whiskey had been transformed from one of the Marine Corps' most problematic installations into a model of effective leadership and unit cohesion. Marines who had been considering leaving the Corps chose to extend their service, while the base became a sought-after assignment for officers seeking to learn from successful leadership practices. Sarah's mission had accomplished far more than originally intended, not only identifying leadership problems, but also demonstrating solutions that could be implemented throughout the Marine Corps. Her experience provided valuable lessons about the importance of understanding leadership from multiple perspectives while maintaining the high standards that Marines deserve from their commanders. The incident with Stevens became part of Marine Corps leadership training curricula, illustrating how toxic behavior could develop when leadership failed to maintain proper standards while also demonstrating how individual courage and competence could prevent situations from escalating out of control. Sarah's response became a case study in tactical proficiency and leadership presence under pressure. Thompson completed his assignment at FOB Whiskey with commendations for his performance and strong recommendations for leadership development opportunities, eventually becoming the kind of Marine leader that Sarah had recognized he could become during their first encounter in the dining facility. Chen was promoted ahead of schedule and selected for advanced leadership training, eventually commanding her own unit with distinction while implementing many of the leadership principles she had observed during Sarah's time at the base. Her success validated Sarah's assessment of her potential and demonstrated the importance of recognizing and developing talent regardless of previous recognition or advancement. Rodriguez continued his exemplary service with renewed energy and purpose, finding that the support and recognition of competent senior leadership allowed him to achieve his full potential as a developer of junior Marines. His experience reinforced the importance of supporting positive leaders who were struggling to maintain standards within dysfunctional systems. Years later, Sarah would reflect on her undercover mission as one of the most valuable learning experiences of her career, providing insights into leadership challenges and solutions that influenced her approach to command throughout the remainder of her service. The mission demonstrated that effective leadership required understanding perspectives from every level of an organization while maintaining the courage to take action when action was needed. The transformation of FOB Whiskey became a model for organizational change throughout the military, proving that even the most challenging leadership problems could be addressed through comprehensive assessment, targeted intervention, and sustained commitment to excellence. Sarah's approach provided a blueprint for identifying and developing leadership potential while removing barriers that prevented Marines from achieving their full capability. The Marine who had once shoved a colonel in the mess hall, unaware of her true rank and authority, had unknowingly triggered a chain of events that would improve the lives and careers of thousands of Marines. The incident that began with disrespect and aggression had ultimately led to transformation and renewal that honored the finest traditions of Marine Corps leadership and service.